The Atlanta Journal and Constitution said that sociological studies show that, like other immigrant groups, Africans who have moved to this country are also thriving economically, but they feel misunderstood and even shunned by Americanized Africans as well as white Americans. If so, why? I'm Tony Brown. I'll be back in a moment with Black Americans and Black Immigrants. Our guests on this program are Dr. David Shawn, the professor of political science at Xavier University in New Orleans, Dr. Letha C., a professor of social work at the University of Georgia. She has done a series of studies on the assimilation of immigrant groups in America. Our next guest is Dr. Kuntima Makiti. Dr. Makiti is a political scientist with the Atlanta Management Institute. I'll start with the gentleman first in reverse order of priority and beauty. And I will ask either of you what your experience has been in America with regard to the subject and where you are from originally, what country in Africa. Dr. Shawn?
I'm originally from the Sudan, North Africa. And when I came to the United States as a graduate student, I studied international relations and international affairs at Drew University in Madison, New Jersey. And I also went to University of Maine, where I studied another master's degree in public administration and public policy. And I came to Atlanta here, where I completed my doctorate in political science with focus on international relations. And I taught at Georgia State University and Georgia Tech, as well as Kennesaw College.
Now, doing all of that education, Dr. Shawn, what has your experience been with Black people or Americanized Africans?
My experience with my brothers here, especially Black African Americans here, has not been pleasant as I thought it should have been. I think they don't know me. I wanted to know about them, but they don't want me to know about them. And in actual fact, I have never been asked by a person of African descent where I come from and what am I doing here. And sometimes I feel there is a sense of rejection. And I think I tend to take that as a result of cultural differences after having been separated for more than 400 years. And I think the people here are more or less westernized. And those of us coming from Africa are somehow looked down because of the images that people see on television about Africa. The footages, they show things like terrorism, people going naked, wild animals, and the perception is that Africans are living with animals, but that's not so. Today,
Dr. Shawn, you were quoted in the Atlanta Journal and Constitution as having some very definite feelings about what you perceive is discrimination against you because of your dark skin by Americanized African women. Was that an accurate statement? Or is that what you believe?
Partly, I think I have had my little experiences as a young man with ladies, just like any other ladies. But I don't think it is a major issue. I think when I was talking with that journalist who wrote that, I talked on a numerous of
But to be specific, and you correct me and the newspaper if this quote is wrong, it said that you dated white women because Black women would not date you because you were so dark.
I think that is extreme. That by itself negated my position.
Did you say that though?
No, I didn't. I didn't say it that way.
You were misquoted?
I said sometimes when you ask a lighter-skinned Black lady, she will turn you down by giving an excuse or by not giving you the right address or the wrong address. And when you invited her, yes. And this not only to me, it happened to other Africans.
But you don't have to be African to be rejected by a woman, Dr.
Not necessarily so. Not necessarily so, yeah. I think we agree on that point.
Yes, okay.
But there is a labeling on Africa that Africans are aggressive, Africans are arrogant, and that Africans are think like the white folks toward the black folks, but that's not true. And it's just because that in this world, some people, you have to be aggressive at times. You have to be persistent. Okay, and there's nothing wrong with that. But as long as you do it with some understanding, I think it is acceptable.
Okay, I'd like to move on.
Okay.
Dr. McKeady, without going into your academic background, what are some of your experiences here with Americans, Black Americans and European Americans, that have shaped your opinion? What is your opinion of being an African from Africa in this country as an immigrant?
My opinion is very mixed in the sense that, first of all, I come from a region with very little or no exposure at all to African Americans or Americans, period. So I didn't have much of the preconceived ideas that one would have about Black Americans. And second, my coming to this country through New York and Temple University was in the 60s, the late 60s, which were a different period anyway. And the kind of African Americans that I was involved with were the ones that were fully aware of what was happening in the world, not only around them, but also in Africa. But that was a special type of African Americans. So with them, I had no problems whatsoever. And then you have, of course, the blacks who didn't have anything to do, not just with me, but with the rest of us who believed in those kind of ideas of the 60s. And that's a different type of experience. And perhaps you take the vast majority who couldn't care less who you were, Black Americans or Black Africans, because when you see you in the street, you're just like anybody else. And so we have to distinguish between all these type of groups before we talk about the types of experiences that we had. And my own position is that I stick with those that believe like I believe, and so I don't have any problems that would be exceptional.
Do you find any tendency, as the Atlanta newspaper pointed out, that Africans, like other immigrants, are economically doing much better or very well, much better than the average Black American? Do you have any particular theory as to why that happens?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure that that is happening because I don't know how big the sample is, the sample that led to that conclusion. I do know, however, that there are quite a few of us here in Atlanta, whether in academia or in the business world, that are doing fairly well. When I say in academia, there are professors. I left Atlanta University only 2 weeks ago, and certainly I was seen on the campus as one of the very successful Africans in academia. And I'm now with Atlanta Management Institute, which was started by an African and run by Africans. And in that sense, you can also talk about successful cases. I know of cases of brothers from Ethiopia who run successful restaurants, and you find a few, particularly in the field of engineering, that are with some firms and doing very well.
And you are from the Congo?
I'm from the Congo, yes.
Dr. Say, I would like to know, you've done several studies on immigrant groups,
Right.
and I know that you have paid attention to the unique adaptation of the non-white immigrants. Mm-hmm. What is your overview of the adaptation of Africans in this country with relationships with Americanized Africans?
It's been my experience that most immigrant groups who come into a foreign country or on a foreign piece of geography, they experience some of the same problems. And this has been no less true for Africans. However, in interviewing a great number of Black Americans or Afro-Americans, if you will, I have found that the Afro-Americans felt no different toward Africans than they did Southeast Asian refugees, because they definitely saw them as a threat to their livelihood, They have the impression that white America will take any other group so long as you can wear a dashiki or you can speak with a foreign language. All of these seem to supersede the Afro-Americans. I don't know why that is, but that is the feeling and the perception that is out there. Another perception is that the first wave of Africans or any other immigrant groups who come into a nation seem to be the more highly educated, the more affluent. They have money, and so they can easily absorb into the power structure or into the community, if you will. It's only when subsequent waves begin to come in, and these groups are more or less from the lower classes, if you will, that the problems really begin to surface. But to answer your question directly, the Africans will experience in the mosaic or in the process of socialization the same kinds of problems that will be experienced by in the others.
Well, Dr.
Now,
C,
yes.
I'm sorry, please finish.
Another area is that it is a perception in the Black community that many Africans have a kind of arrogance. And they accredit this to, they feel that it is very traceable to this British orientation that they have, because it is a perception of Black Americans that the British tend to be rather arrogant, and that they look down on Black Americans rather than saying the brotherhood that I heard expressed here. They don't see that as brotherhood. They say that the Africans come in with this kind of superiority complex. Now, they can refute this, but I'm reporting what the data is suggesting. And so for that reason, we see that there are problems. There are problems with these groups.
I'll let Dr. Cheng answer on the British side, and I would answer the French side.
Okay.
Well, there are, however, cultural differences, not necessarily whether they're Black, white, or any other group. We are Americans. And do you find in any of your data that we are perhaps more, as Black people, more American in our perception of other people than we may ourselves suspect? I'm sure many of us who are Black see ourselves as, totally committed, totally Afrocentric. But I wonder how much of the real American, the old ugly American syndrome,
right,
is really within us and within our personality. Do you have any data to speak to that?
The data also shows that we talk Black power, but we sleep white. Now, what that means in another sense is that we say that we have African roots, and that we are the descendants of great kings, queens, pyramid builders. But when it really comes down to it, we have been so socialized in the Western vernacular, in the Western way of living, until we really defy what we say we are. With the element of color, and I noticed that you brought that up a minute ago. We say that it doesn't make any difference, but we know that the variable of color is very strong, and that we cannot defy the very fact that color plays a very important part in every single segment, because we have been socialized into believing that every young Black woman ought to aspire to look like Miss America as much as possible. And that's good. Miss America is one of us. So that is a debate. Now, we have not in the social sciences laid to rest whether or not there are vestiges of Africanicity still in the Black community. If most of you know the great debate that occurred between Herskovits and Frazier. With Frazier, the Black, of course, saying that we cut all of those ties from Africa, and with Herskovits saying there are still strains of Africanicity still within us because of the soul verbalization, because of the handshakes. All of that can be traceable to Africa, that worldview or the view of the world. So I don't know exactly how to answer what we think in terms of our African roots, but I know that we have been completely socialized by white America.
All right, and accepting that as a premise, I'd like to ask Dr. Sean the next question. I don't think that there are many Black Americans who will not admit that we have been psychologically damaged by slavery, discrimination, segregation, Jim Crow, and racism. On the other hand, Dr. Sean, what is your impression of Africans psychologically as a result of their hundreds of years of psychological indoctrination by European groups?
That is a very good question. I'm not a psychiatrist, nor am I a sociologist. I'm only a political scientist. I look at issues in terms of economics. The experiences that Black Americans have here is that there are two groups of Black Americans. Those who have struggled during the civil rights and have seen what it was 25 years back in this country really do have a different perception and a different worldview compared to the younger generation or the post-civil rights generation. When you look at the post-civil rights generation, practically they tend to identify more or less with the United States, with the Western culture, than you would find their elderly or their parents.
No, Dr. Sean, that's not the direction of my question.
Okay.
I'm asking you to share with us what happened to you on your side of the water.
All right.
We've accepted responsibility for being confused.
What I see here,
I'd like to know if you want to accept a little responsibility for being confused.
Here, I think what I have observed is that many Black Americans tend to not to be sure of themselves.
We've said that.
Yes.
We just keep saying that. I want to get to what some of the young Africans see themselves as.
Oh, the way I see myself as an African, and I see myself to try to extend with an open arms to my brethren here, whether they're from the
You're
Caribbean.
from the Sudan.
Yes, I'm from the Sudan.
Has there ever been imperialism in the Sudan by European governments?
We were ruled by the British for more than 60 years.
For 60 years?
Yes.
Do you believe that this imperialism, which is based on white racism, had anything to do with the psychological development of Sudanese?
No, it hasn't, because the British rule, British colonialism was what we call indirect rule. It did not interfere with the traditional African cultures or the Sudanese cultures for that matter. The British really developed a system only that would suit the British at the time. But the Sudanese nationalism has been resisting that colonialism for more than 60 years.
But we've been resisting racism in America. Well, it doesn't mean it didn't damage us.
Well, in Africa, it has done a lot of damage. In Africa, in the Sudan, and let me talk for Sudan specifically, as a Sudanese. And I would say that my grandfather resisted the British colonialism until the 1930s. Okay, this is because we believe that no man has a right to superimpose his will over another man against his or her will. And for that reason, the British colonialism, in fact, has enforced Sudanese nationalism more than ever. And for that reason, the British never even have what I call a direct control over Sudan.
Let me ask the same question of Dr. Makiti.
Well, I'm sure in the audience, many of you, if you have not read, at least you have heard of W.E.B. Du Bois. In one of his writings, W. Du Bois quotes something that shocked him in Paris when trying to work out a paper to present to Woodrow Wilson on behalf of Africans as to what the Africans have to get from this peace treaty after the war. And the Senegalese representative of the French National Assembly, Lamine Gueye, told him, "I'm French first, not a Negro." And Du Bois was shocked. And so the question that Mr. Brown, you asked, of course we were affected. Otherwise, we would not be talking the way we do now. I began my professorial career as a young instructor of history at Temple University quite a few years ago. And my students in the audience were black and white, but mostly the blacks were shocked that I was going to teach Afro-American history. Why not a black American? And some of them walked out of the room. But I told them that African history, that is your history, my history, and as I begin to talk about African American history, is only one chapter in the long history of our people. There are not two histories. So I'm beginning to talk about this particular chapter. And the problem that you're reacting the way you do is because you have not been taught your own history. Just like I was not taught my own history. I was taught the history of the French, the Belgian, the British, the German on us and around us or about us, but never the history of my own people. And the same with you. And that's that kind of ignorance prompted that kind of reaction. And so being ignorant of who you were or what you were, you can expect all kind of prejudice on my part. Yes, coming from a French background, I did have my times of prejudice with vis-a-vis Black Americans or America, period. Because I came here without any background in English, never studied in English, not even one day in school. I studied other languages. And as I began, there was, of course, the heavy French accent coming out of my mouth, which made sometimes the comprehension very difficult for the others. But instead of helping, sometimes people giggled or they laughed, and I said, well, sister, what other language do you speak? And when they say, well, I can only speak American language, I said, then shut up. I'm trying to communicate with you. I speak at least 8 languages.
Speaking of, if I may pick up on your point, speaking of communicating, I travel quite a bit on college campuses, and I don't think I've ever gone to one campus, particularly to white campuses, in which an African student did not come up to me afterwards and tell me he or she felt alienated by other blacks at that university. Now, I'm not placing blame because I think there's enough blame to go around on both sides. We've both been through a tremendous psychological distortion in perceptions of ourselves, and we both have had our history altered in a number of ways. But I'd like to end the program, or the remaining of the program, to talk about what useful things, Dr. C, if I may ask you to begin, what useful things can we do? We can beat this problem to death, that we don't get along because we have this bridge between us, this gap between us, not this bridge. But what can we do to build a bridge between Africans from the continent and Africans who were brought here hundreds of years ago?
Well, the very first thing that I see on the college campus is precisely what you suggested, and that is the alienation between the two groups. And we have to keep in mind that this is perpetuated many times by professors themselves, because they will play one group against the other. Oh, the African students really are bright, whereas the black students are really not applying
Now, before
themselves.
we leave that point, and before we condemn that professor,
yes,
is it not true that we get the best, the most energetic, the most determined from Africa? In other words,
Absolutely.
We don't get the average African.
Absolutely.
We don't get the African who failed. And the black at the campus is really a typical black American. They're
Absolutely.
not all the cream de la cream. So does it not follow that they are people who are more disciplined, that they are more serious about their education, and that in the result that they are generally, not in all cases, better students?
Absolutely, they are.
That's not a stereotype,
but
is it?
You see what is happening, though. It's not in the context that you placed it. It's in the context of dividing, rather than saying, indeed, these are very bright students, and why don't you all link together and study together? You don't particularly get that piece. You get that these are very bright students from Africa, and you all are really not applying yourselves. You breaking cookies and sipping tea too much. You know, you brothers need to really get down to it. Now, the question that you raised was, how do we fix it? How do we bridge the gap between the Africans that are coming in here and the blacks that are already here on colleges or in the community as such? The very first thing we have to understand is that America is a very racist society. And no matter if your skin is black, you're going to experience some of the racism. So we have to get together and say, well, how do we take our piece of this pie, mold a kind of society? I don't mean separatism. I'm not suggesting that at all. Mold a kind of society, make a contribution to show that we are indeed the descendants of great pyramid builders. We don't have to just sit here and say, because America says this, and this, then we ought to do that.
Okay, for purposes of time, I'd like to get a comment from Dr. Sean.
Yes.
Yeah, in order for us to gap the bridge, I think as a people, we need to accept each other, and we have to work with each other and for each other. I have been in this country. I have never suffered racism in my own country until I came to the United States. Not from my brethren here, but from the country as a whole, as she said, that America is racist, and that is a reality. For me, I think for the African who are here, professional like ourselves, and as well as the African Americans here, we need to open the door of communication to bridge the gap. We need to be sincere and open with each other. We have to put away those negative perceptions or colonial perceptions that have been, as well as racist perception that has been put on us by outsider. We as a people, we feel we are under siege as a race. And how do we do that? The only way we can be able to stand together is by being open with each other and accepting one another.
We have a few seconds. I'd like to Dr. McKeedy. Dr. McKeedy, can you think of one advantage that we would gain as people by remaining at one another's throats and divided? I mean, if you and I don't like each other on sight, is there any possible benefit to either one of us from carrying out that kind of
I can think
prejudice?
of any. I can think of any, but I can think of many. If you and I come together and start talking on campus as students about what you're doing, what I'm doing, and perhaps I'll discover that there is something that I can learn from your field and something that you can learn from my field.
And we're going to learn now. We're out of time. Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.